On September 25, 2025, inside the United Nations headquarters in New York, the 80th annual session of the General Assembly took place as usual. But amid the public speeches, there was one address so secret that even the United Nations itself dared not reveal it. There, Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, was expected to read a 12-page confession drafted by Paris, Washington, and Tel Aviv, forcing him to bow his head before the world. The entire hall held its breath. Would Traoré surrender to the script of humiliation placed before him, or would he rise to defend the honor of Africa in front of hundreds of world leaders and millions watching around the globe? Was this to be remembered as the fall of a young president, or the birth of a new symbol? And then, the moment arrived. When Traoré opened his mouth, his voice did not tremble. It grew stronger with every word as he began listing what he called the first great crime, the transatlantic slave trade. He reminded the assembly that more than 12.5 million Africans had been torn from their homes, shackled in chains, and forced across the ocean. The empires of cotton, sugar, and coffee were built on our blood, he declared. This, he insisted, was not distant history. It was the very foundation of Western wealth. Then came the second crime, financial slavery through the CFA franc. 14 African nations, even in the 21st century, are forced to keep half of their reserves in the French treasury. Since 1960, Traoré said, over $500 billion has been withheld. Is this freedom, or just another kind of chain? He then moved to the third crime, the Rwandan genocide of 1994. 800,000 lives were lost in just 100 days, while France protected the killers. The hall grew tense. Delegates from Paris shifted uncomfortably. Without pause, he spoke of the fourth crime, the debt traps of the International Monetary Fund. Structural adjustment, programs forced cuts to health and education. In Zambia, nearly 40% of the health budget disappeared. Children died not from illness, but from the price of medicine, he thundered. Immediately after came the fifth crime, the destruction of African agriculture. Cocoa farmers in Ghana went bankrupt because of forced market liberalization, while corporations like Nestlé and Cargill made billions. When our farmers fall, their corporations rise, he said. Every charge was met not with applause, but with silence. A silence heavier than words, a silence that meant the accusations could not be denied. But Traoré was not finished. He pushed the accusations even higher. The sixth crime, he said, was the assassination of African leaders. Patrice Lumumba of Congo in 1961 and Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso in 1987, both murdered with foreign involvement. When our leaders spoke of dignity, they were buried, but their voices still rise through us. Next came the seventh crime, Cold War interference. The United States supported dictators like Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, sending weapons while millions starved. Our people received guns instead of bread. Then came the eighth crime, the plundering of Nigeria's oil. Companies like ExxonMobil and Total took enormous wealth, but left behind poisoned rivers and toxic soil. 30 million people still live in that pollution, with life expectancy barely reaching 50. The ninth crime followed. Foreign military bases. The US AFRICOM commands 29 installations across Africa. France still occupies Djibouti. They say it is for stability, Traoré said, but every base is another chain on our sovereignty. Finally came the 10th crime, the manipulation of human rights. Western powers condemn Zimbabwe, Sudan, and Mali, yet stay silent on Chad and Gabon because those regimes serve their interests. For them, human rights are not principles, but weapons, he concluded. By the time the 10th crime was spoken, the hall no longer looked like a diplomatic stage. It felt like a courtroom, and the West stood as the accused. And still, Traoré was not done. He turned, sharp and fearless, ready to call out living names and faces. Emmanuel Macron, he said firmly, is not simply a president. He is the heir to an empire of colonizers. He benefits from the same chains that once dragged Africans across oceans. A visible ripple moved across the French delegation. Some lowered their heads, others scribbled nervously. Then his voice struck deeper. Donald Trump, you turned trade and oil into bargaining chips, bought with the blood of other nations. You claim greatness for your country, yet it is paid for with the suffering of ours. The mention of an American president past or present at such a forum was no small act. Some U.S. diplomats stiffened. Others remained expressionless, but the sting of the accusation was undeniable. And finally, Traoré turned toward the shadowy world of finance. To the directors of the International Monetary Fund, you wear the mask of development, but you are wardens of a financial prison. You strip our budgets, bind our governments, and call it reform. But what you truly build are cages. The hall stirred uneasily. Western delegations shifted in their seats, eyes darting away from the podium. For decades, speeches at the United Nations had been layered in polite language, coded criticism, and cautious diplomacy. Here was a young African president stripping away the veil, calling global powers not partners but perpetrators. In that moment, the chamber was divided not by East and West, not by North and South, but by those who felt indicted and those who felt vindicated. And yet, Traoré was not finished. For after accusation came a pledge. I stand here, Traoré continued, not to beg and not to curse. We ask for no pity. We demand justice. He invoked the name of Thomas Sankara, the fallen leader of Burkina Faso, who decades earlier had spoken of dignity and independence before being assassinated. Sankara was silenced, Traoré said, but his flame is not extinguished. It burns in every African who refuses to kneel. He spoke of a new Africa, not fractured, not dictated to, but united in purpose. We want an Africa that decides for itself, free from debt traps, free from foreign bases, free from the theft of its soil and its spirit. His words carried a rhythm, almost a cadence of scripture, and for a moment, the hall resembled not a forum of diplomats, but a gathering of witnesses. Then he cast his gaze beyond the continent. If the world desires peace, let it restore justice to Africa. If the world seeks fairness, let it lift the chains of debt. Without Africa's dignity, there can be no global balance. Traoré then laid out a vision, the formation of a union of black gold, not merely oil and mineral wealth, but the living strength of the African people themselves. We will renegotiate our place in the world, not as pawns, not as subjects, but as equals. The reaction was palpable. Some delegates sat stunned. Others from Africa and the global south sat taller, as though the words had reached into their own histories. The Western press corps, restrained in their note-taking, suddenly scribbled more furiously. When the applause did not come, it was not because the hall rejected him. It was because no one dared to break the weight of what had just been spoken. What began as a defense had transformed into a prophecy. The moment Ibrahim Traoré stepped away from the podium, the hall did not erupt in applause. It did not descend into chaos either. Instead, a heavy, uncertain silence filled the air. That silence told its own story. What had been spoken could not be dismissed, but neither could it be embraced openly. International delegations responded with subtle gestures rather than words. Diplomats from Europe avoided eye contact. Several African representatives exchanged glances of quiet pride. From Asia and Latin America, there were muted nods, acknowledgement without commitment. The UN, as an institution, chose not to publish Traoré's speech in its official record, citing procedural irregularities. Yet within hours, the full transcript leaked online. The leak spread faster than any press release. Across Africa, social media lit up. In Nairobi, Lagos, Johannesburg, and Dakar, clips of Traoré's declaration, "We ask for no pity. We demand justice," circulated like wildfire. Hashtags tied to Burkina Faso trended in multiple languages. Commentators called it the most defiant African address since the era of decolonization. The diaspora communities were no less stirred. In Paris and London, young Africans marched with placards reading, "Traoré speaks for us." In New York and Washington, African-American leaders drew parallels to their own struggles, seeing in Traoré's defiance a mirror of past civil rights battles. But the global response was not only emotional. Policy circles whispered of a dangerous precedent. If a small, landlocked nation like Burkina Faso could speak this way at the UN, what would prevent others from following? The fear was not of Traoré alone, but of a ripple effect, a chorus of voices refusing the language of dependency. And while the world murmured, America itself faced the speech head-on. In the United States, the reactions came quickly, and they were divided. Major newspapers treated the speech cautiously. Some dismissed it as rhetorical theater, while others noted the gravity of its historical claims. Cable news channels debated Traoré's audacity, with some anchors asking, "Is this young African leader reckless, or is he reshaping the moral conversation of our time?" Within policy circles in Washington, concern was immediate. Analysts at think tanks warned that Traoré's message could undermine American influence across Africa. Congressional staffers noted with unease that he had named a former U.S. president directly in his accusations. The State Department avoided direct comment, but reaffirmed America's commitment to partnership with Africa. Yet outside officialdom, the American public, particularly older generations, absorbed the speech differently. Many who had lived through the Cold War heard echoes of another era, when fiery voices from abroad challenged U.S. policy on the world stage. For some, it sparked discomfort. Was America once again seen as an oppressor rather than a partner? For others, it stirred reluctant respect. At least he had the courage to speak his truth. African-American communities reacted with visible energy. Churches in Atlanta, Detroit, and Chicago referenced Traoré's words in Sunday sermons, framing them as part of a larger moral awakening. Commentaries on radio programs asked whether the United States itself, born out of rebellion against empire, could recognize the justice in Africa's demands. In the realm of Africa news, mentions of Burkina Faso spiked across U.S. platforms. For many Americans, this small nation had barely registered in daily headlines. Now, thanks to Traoré, it was a focal point of global debate. The question hanging in the air was unavoidable. Is Ibrahim Traoré passing figure of defiance, or is he the beginning of a new chapter in world history? And just when it seemed the story had settled into analysis and debate, an unexpected twist reshaped the entire narrative. What the world had expected on that September day was a confession, a humiliating spectacle in which a young African president would be forced to acknowledge guilt written by others. Instead, Ibrahim Traoré delivered something no one had scripted, an indictment. In that instant, the balance of power shifted. The ultimatum, carefully drafted by Paris, Washington, and Tel Aviv, was meant to close the chapter on Burkina Faso's defiance. Yet by folding the document and setting it aside, Traoré transformed weakness into strength. He seized the narrative, not as a defendant standing trial, but as a prosecutor calling the West to account. Observers later remarked that the real brilliance of the moment was not only in what he said, but in what he refused to say. By denying the ultimatum a single word of legitimacy, he exposed the hollowness of Western authority. The confession became irrelevant. The indictment became immortal. For the first time in decades, An African leader did not frame his words within Western approval. He framed them within Africa's dignity, and that dignity resonated far beyond the walls of the UN. But the twist did not end there. The image of Traoré himself began to take on a life larger than politics. Within days, photographs of Ibrahim Traoré leaving the UN hall, clutching the file of Western crimes, spread across front pages and social media feeds. Commentators compared it to historic images of Mandela raising a fist or Nkrumah declaring independence. Traoré was no longer seen merely as the president of Burkina Faso. He was emerging as a symbol of Africa's defiance. What startled many in the West was how quickly his message traveled beyond Africa. In Latin America, youth activists echoed his words about dignity and debt. In Asia, commentators spoke of a new, multipolar voice challenging old hierarchies. And in Europe itself, marginalized communities cited his speech as proof that truth could not be silenced. The phrase, "Union of Black Gold," became a rallying cry across Africa news platforms. It symbolized not only oil and minerals, but the strength of Africa's people and culture. Hashtags bearing his name trended worldwide. For millions, the speech represented not just one man's defiance, but a continent's awakening. The twist was clear. A moment designed to break Ibrahim Traoré had instead elevated him. The ultimatum faded into obscurity, while the indictment became history, and Burkina Faso, once barely noticed on global maps, now stood as a torchbearer of African sovereignty. From that moment on, the question was not whether Traoré would be remembered, but how his legacy would shape the battles still to come. As Ibrahim Traoré stepped down from the podium, the weight of history seemed to follow him. What began as a carefully staged attempt to force his submission ended instead with a thunderclap of defiance. The so-called confession, meant to humiliate him, had been transformed into something entirely different. In his hands, it was no longer a script of defeat. It had become a case file, a living record of Western crimes, not written by his accusers, but rewritten by his courage and resolve. From that day forward, Traoré ceased to be seen merely as the president of Burkina Faso. He became something larger, something enduring, a voice for Africa's dignity, a symbol of resistance against centuries of exploitation, and a living reminder that even the smallest nations can challenge the mightiest powers. His image, captured on camera with the file of Western crimes under his arm, became an icon of defiance, one that future generations would study as a turning point, not only in African politics, but in world history. His closing words continue to echo far beyond the marble walls of the UN. "We did not ask permission to be free. We stood up to claim it." Those words now live in the hearts of millions, from Ouagadougou to New York, from Dakar to Washington. They resonate in the marketplaces of Africa, in the classrooms of Europe, in the churches of America, and in the streets of Asia. They remind the world that freedom is never given. It is seized by those who dare to demand it. For the audience, there are lessons here that cannot be ignored. The first lesson is about dignity. True dignity does not come from titles, wealth, or recognition by foreign powers. It comes from standing firm when the world expects you to bow. Dignity is not granted, it is lived. Traoré's act shows us that even when every seat of power conspires against you, one honest voice can carry further than 1,000 empty declarations. The second lesson is about memory. Too often, the world asks the oppressed to forget to erase the past in order to keep the peace. But peace without truth is merely silence. Traoré reminded the world that the wounds of slavery, colonization, and economic exploitation are not forgotten pages in a closed book. They are part of the living memory of nations, and unless they are acknowledged, justice will never truly be done. The third lesson is about courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Traoré faced a hall filled with the most powerful nations on earth, armed not with weapons, but with words. He had no guarantee that his speech would change anything, yet by speaking, he changed everything. For us as individuals, the challenge is similar. We may never stand at the UN, but each of us faces moments when silence is easy, yet speaking truth is necessary. Courage in small moments builds the foundation for change in great ones. And finally, there is a lesson about identity and pride. Traoré did not frame his words to seek Western approval. He framed them within Africa's dignity. He showed that our cultures, our languages, our histories are not burdens to hide, but treasures to protect. For every nation and every people, the message is clear. True strength comes when we stop imitating others and begin embracing who we are. Pride in one's heritage is not arrogance, it is survival. It is the root from which freedom grows. To you, the listener, the question is simple yet profound. What will you do with this story? Will you allow it to be just another headline, another passing controversy, or will you take it as a call to action, a reminder that truth matters more than convenience, that dignity is worth more than comfort, and that justice cannot wait for permission? Traoré's words challenge us all. We did not ask permission to be free. We stood up to claim it. Can you say the same in your own life? In your workplace, in your family, in your community? Are you living as one who waits for permission, or one who stands to claim what is right? This is not only Africa's lesson, it is a universal one. Nations, like individuals, must decide whether they will live as subjects of circumstance or as authors of destiny. Traoré chose the latter, and by doing so, he reminded us that freedom, once claimed, cannot be contained. So let this story live beyond the screen. Share it if the courage of Ibrahim Traoré speaks to you. Subscribe if you believe that truth must outlast headlines. Stand, in your own way, with those who stand for freedom. God bless Africa. God bless every nation that dares to rise. And may justice be heard not only in the halls of power, but in the hearts of all who still believe in the dignity of humanity.